Session begins. Our next speaker is Dr. Renuka Iyer. She's co-director of the Liver Pancreas Tumor Center and section chief of GI Oncology at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center in Buffalo, New York, and is a wonderful speaker to have on our panel today to talk about the new developments in testing and tissue banking material for research. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Iyer. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to all of you for staying this late in the day. So I was tasked with talking to you about the importance of a shared patient tissue bank. These are my disclosures. And the objective, or what I'm hoping to convey to you, is that there are some gaps in knowledge. We have been trying here to tell you a lot about what's known, but as you know, there are also things we don't know, and what those are, or at least some of them, and how data and tissue bank samples, availability of samples, and blood samples can really help meet some of this need and fill some of those gaps. And then tell you specifically how I hope to contribute to this gap and an effort at Roswell Park that we're building, a biobank where you can potentially be part of. So as you all know, and you've been hearing all day, the incidence of neuroendocrine cancers is increasing. And from just some years ago, in 2008, there was a paper by Dr. Yao, and he shared that the incidence is about 5 per 100,000, and now we think it's almost 7 per 100,000, which is it's a big jump in a 6-year period. And in terms of prevalence, how many patients are currently living with this diagnosis from the SEER database, we think it's close to almost 200,000 people. And we know it's second most common after colon cancer in terms of prevalence. Yet when you look and see the amount of research monies that are set aside to do research and the availability of tissues to do and make some progress, the proportion is much, much lower. 25% of patients have multifocal cancer, meaning when they're diagnosed, there's more than one. And the surgeons tend to feel the bowel and find the other ones. And why? Why does that happen? We don't fully appreciate it, and we don't understand that. About 20% of patients have some other cancer in their lifetime while they're diagnosed. Why? And which cancers? We don't really know that very well either. And this is just a graphic representation, and if you look and see the curve of all cancers is the blue line, and when you look at neuroendocrine, that's a steep curve. It's heading upwards, and that's why we are all paying attention and we care. But in addition to knowing that this trend, things are increasing, we don't understand why within the subset of these increases, older patients more than 65 are getting diagnosed more so than people who are younger or 50 to 64. We know that this increase has occurred across all sites and across all stages, but there are some certain subsets where the increase is even more. Like, for example, in lung neuroendocrine. Is it because there's more lung cancer screening? We don't know. Gastric carcinoids, is it more because they're using more proton pump inhibitors? You have to guess. We don't know for sure. Or are there more endoscopies and screenings going on for people with heartburn? And so all of these other things that we have learned are still limited because the SEER database that we use as a place to go ask these questions is limited with the information it has. And many of us, when we sit at these conferences and we talk to each other, we say, hey, you know, my patient has rheumatoid arthritis. Oh, mine has lupus. And we find some things that a lot of our patients have, and we don't know whether there are other doctors seeing the same thing. So are there other conditions associated? We don't know enough. Also, the incidence of carcinoid syndrome. You will hear over the next day or so, a lot has been learned about this condition and how to treat it, new drugs that help patients who are having diarrhea. But truly, what is the incidence of carcinoid syndrome? It's a bit of a guess. This one paper, they looked to see if there were 2 insurance claims of flushing and diarrhea within 3 months before the neuroendocrine cancer diagnosis, and used that to say, yes, this person has carcinoid syndrome. So if we really knew the impact, we could study it better and make a difference. And lastly, food and cancer risk. I'm sure, for some of you, food has become challenging. Eating and shopping and what to do and how to eat is not easy when you go out to someone's house or for a meal. But in addition to that, knowing what to avoid, etc., more and more research has been done to find out what foods may be associated with protective effects on the gut, protecting you from getting cancer, prevention, and potentially causative. And this is also something we don't know enough about neuroendocrine patients. And in addition to all these things, one of the problems with all these numbers is that we did not have a malignant diagnosis code for neuroendocrine cancer. We called it carcinoid, we thought it was benign. So many of these numbers may be sort of falsely low because we just didn't capture them. And so we really probably used all different codes for these patients. And a lot of the research, lots has been learned and lots has been achieved. But most of it was done in big cancer centers where these patients, all of you, were able to go and get access to these trials. And so a lot of the research is coming from major centers, and all of the research we have done so far comes from less than 20% of all the neuroendocrine patient samples. So there's 80% more that's sitting, and we're not using it because it's sitting in little places in different hospitals all over the country. We know the average survival, at least from all diagnoses, all comers, is about 10 years. And living with anything for 10 years has to have a big impact on your emotions, the finances, decision-making, and access to care. We know patients who have multidisciplinary care do better. Is that really happening? Is that why the patients are having better outcomes now? Are those patients with access doing better than those without? All of this we don't know, and we don't have a good way to know. So how would this biobank advance the field and help meet some of these or fill some of these gaps? One of the things that it could do is understand why NETs are rising in incidence. Because these databases are basically relying on whatever the hospital has put inside, here, as patients themselves come and say, well, this was my diagnosis, this is where I was, now we learn what codes were assigned, and we pick up potentially more patients and realize that we need to be using these codes and classifications to identify them. What concomitant medications have patients been taking? What impact did they have? There have been many studies saying aspirin can protect from colon cancer. Metformin, what role does it have? We don't know what many of you take because we only know for those who are on clinical trials. And that's important also to study, and any other associations. And you can find that if it's patient-driven and patients provide that information. Also, having a resource, a single place where all these questions can be asked is important. Many researchers have made great discoveries, but to take them to that next step, they did this out of 30 samples, 60 samples. They want a bigger data set where they can validate some of their findings, and if they have a question, potentially to ask it in a larger sample. So that's what this would help us achieve. And you've heard Dr. House speak here and Dr. Odorisio, and their group has the only NET Spore, which is a very large grant that allows them to study many aspects of neuroendocrine biology and therapy, and they've been able to make important contributions to the field because of this concerted effort. Many doctors, different specialties, one place, all focused on the same thing, different aspects of it. And that's one place that has this. But the rest of the country, there are so many speakers here. You've heard us all. We care. And we don't all have access to the tissues that they do. And potentially this could build that bigger repository for all the other people to now consolidate their efforts and work together. And I want to give you 2 examples of that. The NIH did some studies and invited people with paragangliomas and pheochromocytomas to come and participate in a trial where they did multiple scans to figure out what is the best scan. And now they know we should use gallium scans to follow these patients. This is the best, most sensitive test. And they wouldn't have been able to do it if they didn't have that grant and they didn't invite all the patients to come there. And we all referred our patients there. And that's how that progress and that was learned. And we understood some things about the genes that are involved. In the beginning, it was just SDHD, SDHB, and now we know there are so many more. I remember when I was in med school, I'm older than I look, and it was 10% of pheochromocytomas have genetic associations, and now it's 40%. And how did we find that out? There were concerted efforts from single institutions inviting all the patients to come and help us learn that. The other thing that they did at the NIH was they invited, small bowel neuroendocrine patients come and say, is there anything else associated? Is my family at risk? Of course, you care about your family. You worry. You don't want what happened to you to happen to them if it can be avoided. And we always told them, no, we don't know anything about it. And then they invited people who had 2 family members, blood relatives, with small bowel cancers, and they did studies, genetic studies, and found that there is a gene associated with inositol phosphate that basically doesn't allow P53, which is a tumor suppressor gene, to work very well. So we don't suppress the tumor, it grows, and we wouldn't have known this if they hadn't done that. So this basically conveys that even small centers can make contributions and advance the field if they had access. This central resource, the same sort of theme here is, you all have traveled here and you've learned so much from each other, as much as you've taught us from the questions you're asking us. But having one concerted place where you can get more information about anything that has changed in the world relating to the genetics of this disease, for example, would be helpful, so the pressure of having to travel all the time to go learn would be a little bit less. There are also many questions regarding practice patterns. So what if outcomes in one particular geographic zone are not the best? Or we learned that there is a lot of financial toxicity. People are really burdened by the cost of care in some area. What does this tell us? It tells us we need to go and figure out what's happening with the payers in that region. What are they doing? Why are they not covering? Are they not giving these patients adequate support to get through their diagnosis and their care? And lastly, how does research happen? We apply for grants. There have been very, very generous pharmaceutical sponsors for this program and for all of the research that we do. But in addition to that, we want to get NIH grants, big government sponsorships or foundations that support research. And they don't fund you if you only have 20 samples. They want to know that you have enough to make a difference and really do something impactful. Another big thing that's happening in the field is immunotherapy. We're so excited. It's making a big difference in many cancers. But what is the role of the immune system in neuroendocrine cancer? How does the immune system recognize this particular disease, and how are people able to live with it for such a long time? This is not very well studied, and having those immune cells banked and available to study that would really help advance the field. So how could you or a patient that you come across in many of your interactions contribute? By being part of this biobank or registry, we would access or get permission to put things relating to your medical history into the bank. But in addition, we would ask if you would be interested in providing us a sample of blood that you would get drawn whenever you go for blood work and mail it back to us in a self-paid envelope. And those immune cells that we get from that would be immortalized so that any researcher that comes decades from now and wants to study it would have access to it and can basically use it over and over. And if you've had surgery, we wouldn't want to deplete biopsy tissue because you may need it for something else that you're doing. But if you've had surgery, generally there's more tissue. And then if you've had serial surgeries, having pieces from each of those, which we don't have access to otherwise, would also be something that we would use. But the amount that we would take is the size of a nail clipping. It's not a lot, and it would help fill this bank with information. In addition, patients could potentially let people know that they come across, in waiting rooms, other people that you hear about having this rare disease. And of course, you can also contribute because this is all done from philanthropic funds. And if you wanted to do a sort of fundraiser, you could help us with that too. But what would you get or what would happen after this registry is set up? As we reach milestones, we would share with you, hey, we've got so many tissues of this particular diagnosis, or these are the correlations we're finding with outcomes and so on. And it would be shared on the site and shared with whoever, put their emails and participated. And as a stakeholder, because your participation or whoever participates is now involved, they're vested, because it's like you bought a share. And our hope is that as this builds, that as we write grants, we wouldn't want to just use all the tissues. We would want to make sure that representatives of each subset of neuroendocrine cancer can come and say, I am from this small hospital, but there's a brilliant researcher here, and he has this question. How can we get him these tissues? And so your advocacy for the people that have important questions to ask and facilitating those connections would be very important. And some grant organizations also want patient advocates as part of the project, so that all aspects of it are looked at, not just from a research perspective. I might be interested, but does it matter to you? And all of the data that we generate in terms of, let's say, financial toxicity and so on, could be used by you and other advocacy groups to go back and negotiate for better coverage and covering second opinions, for example, etc. So here it is. It took some time, but it's built. That's what the website's going to look like. Just some information about it, listing, what this bank is and what it isn't. I don't know where they found that picture, but and then there's this pre-screening questionnaire, and we have a little handout that also has it. And essentially what it says is, what is your name? Have you been diagnosed? It's not for people who have suspected disease or not diagnosed with neuroendocrine. It's only for people who actually have the diagnosis. And it would be, how would you prefer to be contacted, electronically or by phone? How would you like, by mail? How would you like to fill the questionnaire? And who is filling this? Are you doing it, or is someone doing it on your behalf, so we know? And then this is what would happen. So at some different organizations' websites or our website, if you decided to participate, you would see the link and you would fill this form and send the pre-questionnaire. And the moment we get that, essentially either you online sort of click submit, it generates an email to the coordinator, or if you mail it in, she gets it in the mail. And then all this happens behind the scene. You don't have to know exactly what it is. It's too small for you to see. But basically, a whole cascade of things happens. She sends you a questionnaire and asks for your consent to get data and to get tissue and to get blood. And whichever ones you're interested in or the patient is interested in doing, if they may do one, they may do two, they may do all three. She sends you the sort of kit for the blood draw, and she contacts those different hospitals and gets all the data and uses that. And then the questionnaire can be filled online, or it can be filled via paper, and then she would enter it. And behind the scenes, once these samples and all this data comes in, there are three pieces of it. One is the data, which is the sort of the first circle that you see, and it is built in a database where we're using search terms that are universal. So if anyone had a question, it's very easy for me to go and say, yes, we do have 100 pancreatic neuroendocrine samples, and they are from this age range to this age range, and so on and so forth. And for half of them, I also have blood, and for 80%, I also have tissue. So I can quickly ask those kinds of questions. They've been on what therapies, what was the sequence of therapies, all of that would be easy for me to pull. The second is the blood. So if patients said, yes, we would like to give you immune cells, they would have blood drawn at wherever they went, Quest or their hospital lab, and just drop the packet in the mail. And we would get it, process it, and we actually, Roswell Park has a familial ovarian cancer registry. So the systems to do this are already in place. We do this for that registry already. And they would process the samples, pull out the immune cells, and immortalize them and store them, de-identified with just an ID number. And last is the tissue. So if someone has had surgery in a small little hospital somewhere and nobody's going to use the tissue anyway, we would ask for them to send us a piece and store that. And then periodically on the website and through an email, like annually, we would inform participants and here at this annual meeting on what is happening with enrollment as the data and the database build up. And anything that we publish or report would also be, everyone would be informed of it. And ultimately, hopefully in a year or 2 years from now, we would, because this data is mature, meaning we have follow-up. If the surgery may have happened 5 years ago, so we know what happened to you for 5 years, and that would be very helpful to write grants and build more collaborations. So in terms of timelines, and I will soon end, in June we completed testing all the links, that big giant chart that had little colorful boxes. So all those links are working, and we finalized what questions we would put in the database as questionnaires and send it to the IRB, and it is approved. We're just waiting for them to approve the paper materials that we would mail out. And we hope by November to have this all cleaned up and ready to go, giving it a month, and always estimate a little extra. You're always behind what you think. And hope to send it to a few support group leaders to test out and see how, the links are all working and so on and so forth. And by December, we hope to enroll some patients from Roswell, do some mock entries, and see if when we query whether we're getting the information the way we hoped to get it. And open to enrollment by the beginning of the year or sooner. So Jasmine is this wonderful woman. I had hoped she would come, but she couldn't. And she would be the contact person. She's a physician by training and really enjoys, she's been working with the ovarian registry and really enjoys interacting with patients. So she would be the point person for contact. So takeaways, what am I here to convey and sort of tell you about where this stands? Knowledge is power, and together we really have the power to create new knowledge. Food, supplements, genes, exercise. There is a lot more we are learning about these things in other cancers, but together with the questions that we've put together in this questionnaire, we could learn even more. And outcomes, you've learned a lot about the therapies, and you will continue to learn a lot more about the therapies, but access to them and having someone paying for them is also important, and measuring it will allow us to get rid of some of the barriers and identify them if there are any barriers. This immune system thing, this is going to be a recurring theme. If you read the news, anywhere you go, this is constantly appearing, and more work is being done, and that's great, but there could be more if we were making this concerted effort. And I think in general, as a final word, I read this article once. There's this gentleman, he's a physicist, his name is Freeman Dyson, and he was interviewed for an article called The 60-Year Job. So it was people who've worked for 60 years or longer. He's kind of old. And they asked him, so what advice, one of the questions they asked him is, what advice do you have for young people starting their career, now? And he said, take every chance to take responsibility, even if you feel you're not qualified to do so. And if you think of NCAN, and if you think of the Para-FIO Alliance, and you think of everybody who's up here and the things we've said, we all started somewhere, not thinking we could do anything, but we took some responsibility and said, I'm going to try. And we did, and here we are. And he went on to say, people who got Nobel Prizes did not know they were doing Nobel Prize-winning work when they were doing it. They just did it because they believed in it and they thought it needed to get done. And so I think everyone can contribute. And this diagnosis has been, I'm sure, for many of you, a mixed blessing. You didn't know you would meet these people that you've met here today, and so many other amazing individuals in your care team. And everyone can contribute if we just knew how. And I think more minds working together is quicker progress. And I hope you will agree with that. So thank you. Thank you for having me.